Just now, evidence is emerging that Queen Elizabeth herself may have quietly worked behind the scenes to ensure William, not Charles, would define the future of the crown. Was she right all the time? Well, today I am pulling back the curtain on one of the most guarded secrets in royal history. Queen Elizabeth II, the woman who dedicated 70 years of her life to the institution of the crown, did not believe her own son was fit to lead it. And more than that, she may have actively tried to do something about it. Not openly, not publicly. The palace would never allow that, but through a series of quiet, deliberate moves, stretching across decades, Elizabeth is believed to have worked to position William as the true future of the monarchy. Not Charles, William. Now, to understand why this claim is so explosive, you need to understand what it would actually mean. In Britain, the rules of succession are not simply a matter of preference. They are enshrined in law, specifically in the Succession to the Crown Act of 2013, which updated centuries of royal succession legislation. Under that law, Charles was always next in line. Nothing Elizabeth felt privately could change that legally. But here is what most people do not understand. A monarch does not need to change the law to shape the future. They have something far more powerful at their disposal: influence, access, and time. Elizabeth had 70 years on the throne to quietly build the architecture of what came after her. She controlled who was groomed, who was trusted, who was brought into the inner circle of real royal power, and who was kept at arm's length. And according to multiple sources close to the palace, that architecture was built with William at its center. Not Charles. Think about that for a moment. This is not a fringe conspiracy theory circulating on social media. These are claims rooted in insider accounts, royal biographies, and a pattern of behavior stretching back to the 1990s. A pattern that, once you see it, is very difficult to unsee. The timing of this story matters too. It is emerging now, in the early years of Charles's reign, precisely because the tension between what Elizabeth wanted and what Charles is doing is becoming impossible to ignore. Sources close to the current royal household say the friction between Charles's court and William's camp has never been more pronounced, and it all traces back to one fundamental question: what did Elizabeth actually want? She was not a woman who left things to chance. Every public appearance was calculated, every statement was measured, every silence was deliberate. So when you look at the decisions she made in her final years, the people she elevated, the roles she created, the access she granted, a picture begins to emerge. A picture that tells a very different story from the official one. The bombshell is not just that Elizabeth had doubts about Charles. Royal watchers have speculated about that for years. The bombshell is that she may have done something about it, quietly, strategically, and with the full weight of the crown behind her. But before we get to the evidence, we quickly need to understand something that the palace has spent decades trying to manage. Queen Elizabeth was never fully at ease with the idea of Charles as king. That is not speculation. That is a conclusion drawn from decades of royal reporting, insider accounts, and the behavior of the institution itself. And to understand why, you have to go back to the moment everything changed. Diana. The marriage of Charles and Diana was not just a personal disaster. It was an institutional catastrophe. It forced the monarchy into the most damaging public relations crisis it had faced since the abdication of Edward VIII in 1936. Elizabeth watched it all unfold. The affairs, the leaks to the press, the famous Panorama interview where Diana told the world there were 3 people in her marriage. And Elizabeth, who had built her entire reign on dignity, discretion and duty, was appalled. But here is what is rarely discussed. Elizabeth was not just appalled by the chaos. She was appalled by Charles's judgment. Sources who were close to the Queen in the 1990s have described her as deeply concerned, not just about the divorce, but about what Charles's handling of it revealed about his character, his inability to manage the situation quietly, his willingness to let things spiral into public spectacle, his prioritization of personal desire over institutional duty. These were not small concerns for a woman who had sacrificed her entire personal life on the altar of that duty. But then came Camilla. The Camilla question haunted Elizabeth for years, not because she was personally hostile to Camilla Parker Bowles as a person, but because she understood with absolute clarity what Camilla represented to the British public. She represented the affair, the betrayal of Diana, the chaos of the 1990s, and Elizabeth knew that any rehabilitation of Camilla would come at a cost to the institution she had given everything to protect. There is a telling detail that royal insiders have pointed to repeatedly. For years, long after Charles and Camilla were together publicly, Elizabeth refused to appear alongside Camilla at official engagements. This was not accidental. It was a signal, quiet, deniable, but absolutely deliberate. Elizabeth communicated through protocol and presence, and her absence alongside Camilla spoke volumes. What is less well known is that Elizabeth's doubts about Charles went beyond Camilla. Those close to her have described a long-standing concern about his temperament. His notorious rages, the explosive outbursts that staff privately referred to as the volcano, were not unknown to the Queen. Neither was his tendency toward obsession, toward causes that distracted from the core business of being a constitutional monarch. Elizabeth believed in one thing above all others: the crown must never become about the person wearing it. But Charles, in her view, had spent decades making it exactly that. And as she watched William grow, steady, disciplined, focused, the contrast became impossible to ignore. She was not watching a backup plan develop. She was watching, some insiders believe, her real plan take shape. Now here is where this story moves from royal gossip into something far more significant, because there is evidence. In 2012, Queen Elizabeth made an extraordinary decision. She invited William and Kate, then less than 2 years into their marriage, to represent the Crown on a Diamond Jubilee tour of the Commonwealth. This was not a routine assignment. The Commonwealth tour is one of the most politically significant duties in the royal calendar. It signals trust. It signals succession. It signals who the institution believes in. Charles, notably, was not sent. William was. Royal historians flagged it at the time as unusual, but the palace brushed it off as a scheduling matter. Sources now say it was anything but. Then there is the matter of the Royal Victorian Order. In her final years, Elizabeth personally awarded William a series of honours that went beyond what is typical for an heir-in-waiting. These were honours within her personal gift, meaning they required no government countersignature. They were Elizabeth's alone to give, and she gave them to William with a frequency and significance that courtiers noticed. But perhaps the most striking piece of evidence is something that happened entirely out of public view. According to accounts from multiple sources familiar with the inner workings of the palace, Elizabeth held a series of private meetings with William in the final years of her reign. Not briefings, not routine family dinners, structured conversations about the future of the monarchy, about what needed to change, about what Charles's reign might look like, and what William's needed to look like after it. These conversations, sources say, went far beyond anything Elizabeth had with Charles at the same stage of his preparation. There is also the question of the letters. Elizabeth was a prolific private correspondent. She wrote letters, handwritten, personal, deeply considered, to those she trusted most. And according to sources cited in multiple royal biographies, she wrote to William with a regularity and intimacy that surprised even those close to her. What was in those letters has never been confirmed publicly, but insiders who are aware of their existence describe them as containing something closer to a blueprint than a blessing: guidance, vision, a sense of what the monarchy needed to become. Then there is the constitutional dimension that most commentators have overlooked. A monarch cannot legally bypass succession, but a monarch can do something almost as powerful. They can delay the transfer of certain royal duties, patronages, and institutional relationships, keeping them in their own hands rather than passing them to the Prince of Wales and then pass them directly to the next generation, which is precisely what Elizabeth did in several key areas in her final decade. Patronages that should have gone to Charles went instead to William and Kate. Relationships with Commonwealth leaders that would normally be cultivated by the heir were instead built directly with William. The architecture was being constructed quietly, deliberately, one brick at a time. That is the part of this story that changes everything, because the picture that emerges from those close to the palace is not of a young prince simply being groomed in the traditional sense. It is of a man who understood exactly what his grandmother was doing, and who quietly, deliberately chose to become what she needed him to be. Start with the bond itself. Elizabeth's relationship with William was by all accounts unlike anything she had with her other grandchildren. It was not simply affectionate, it was purposeful. From the time William was a teenager, Elizabeth included him in conversations that went far beyond what was appropriate for his age or position. She took him into her confidence about institutional matters. She shared with him her philosophy of monarchy, duty before self, crown before individual, silence over spectacle. These were lessons she had spent 70 years living, and she chose William as the person she most wanted to carry them forward. But here is the detail that very few people know. When Diana died in 1997, it was Elizabeth who made the most consequential decision about William's future, not Charles. Elizabeth personally oversaw the structure of William's education, his military service, and his early royal engagements. Charles was present, of course, but the guiding hand, sources say, was Elizabeth's. She was not just raising a grandson, she was, in the view of those closest to her, raising a king. Then there is the matter of Kate. Elizabeth's approval of Kate Middleton went far deeper than public warmth. Those inside the palace describe Elizabeth as having been actively involved in signalling her support for the relationship at a critical moment. When Charles and William clashed, as they did repeatedly, over the pace and nature of William's royal duties, it was Elizabeth who intervened, not loudly, never loudly, but with the quiet authority that only she possessed. She made clear that William's path would not be dictated by Charles's preferences, it would be dictated by the needs of the institution, and she was the institution. There is also something deeply revealing in how William has spoken, or rather chosen not to speak, about his grandmother. In the years since Elizabeth's death, William has been notably more guarded about discussing her than other members of the family. But those who have been in the room when William speaks about Elizabeth privately describe something closer to reverence than grief, a sense of mission, a sense that he carries something she gave him that goes beyond title or duty. There is one moment that royal insiders return to repeatedly when this subject comes up. At Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee in 2022, just months before her death, she appeared on the Buckingham Palace balcony. She chose who stood beside her. It was not Charles. It was William, Kate, and their children. The official explanation was that the balcony appearance was limited to working royals. But Elizabeth had broken that rule before when she wanted to. She did not break it then. The message, those close to her say, was entirely intentional. This is the future. But if Elizabeth was quietly positioning William, there is one question that cuts to the heart of everything. Did Charles know? The answer, according to those familiar with the inner dynamics of the royal family, is yes. Not in the sense of a formal confrontation, not in the sense of Elizabeth sitting Charles down and telling him directly that she had doubts about his suitability. That was never Elizabeth's way. But Charles is not a man without political intelligence. He has spent his entire adult life studying power, how it moves, how it is communicated, how it is withheld, and he saw what was happening. Sources close to Charles describe a growing tension in the final years of Elizabeth's reign that went beyond the normal friction between a monarch and an heir-in-waiting. There was, those sources say, a quiet but unmistakable campaign on Charles's part to reassert his position, to make clear that he would not be managed, that he would not be bypassed, and that when the crown came to him, it would come on his terms. The clearest expression of this was Camilla. The elevation of Camilla Parker Bowles to Queen Consort, confirmed in February 2022, just months before Elizabeth's death, was not simply a matter of love or loyalty. It was a statement. Charles had spent decades being told, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that Camilla was a liability, a reminder of the chaos of the 1990s, a figure the public would never fully accept. But in February 2022, with Elizabeth's blessing, or at least her public acquiescence, Charles drew a line. Camilla would be Queen Consort, not Princess Consort, as had long been suggested as a compromise. Queen Consort. It was Charles asserting dominance over the narrative that had defined and constrained him for 30 years. But then there is what happened after Elizabeth died. The speed with which Charles moved to consolidate power was, by royal standards, extraordinary. Within weeks of accession, Charles had restructured the household. Staff were let go, patronages were reassigned. The vast machinery of the monarchy was reorganized around Charles's vision, not Elizabeth's, and not William's. There is one particularly telling detail. Several of the patronages and institutional relationships that Elizabeth had quietly steered toward William during her final years were, after Charles's accession, redirected back through the King's office, not taken from William entirely, but brought back under Charles's oversight and control. It was subtle enough to be deniable, but those inside the palace understood exactly what it meant. Charles was reclaiming territory, and there is something else that has gone largely unreported. Sources familiar with the relationship between Charles and William describe the period immediately following Elizabeth's death as one of significant strain, not public conflict, but a series of private disagreements about roles, about timing, about the future shape of the monarchy that left those around both men genuinely concerned. The unity displayed at Elizabeth's funeral was real in one sense, but behind it, sources say, was a negotiation about what Elizabeth had intended, and about whether Charles intended to honor it. Here is something the royal correspondents rarely say out loud, but all of them know. The palace is not one institution, it is several, and right now, those institutions are in quiet, sustained conflict with each other. On one side, you have the King's household, Buckingham Palace, reorganized and rebuilt in Charles's image, smaller than Elizabeth's operation, but intensely focused. Charles has spent 50 years waiting for this moment, and his team reflects that, experienced, politically savvy, and deeply protective of the King's vision. On the other side, you have Kensington Palace, William and Kate's operation, and here is what most people do not understand about Kensington Palace. It is not simply a satellite of the main royal machine. Under William and Kate, it has become something closer to a parallel institution. It has its own communications team, its own strategic priorities, its own relationships with press and public, and increasingly, its own agenda. Sources familiar with both households describe a relationship between the two camps that is professional on the surface, but deeply competitive underneath. The competition is not personal, exactly. It is institutional. It is about who controls the narrative of the monarchy. It is about whose vision of what the crown should be in the 21st century ultimately wins, and it maps almost perfectly onto the fault line that Elizabeth's alleged preferences created. Charles wants a slimmed-down monarchy focused on tradition and continuity. William wants something more modern, more accessible, more accountable, more connected to the concerns of ordinary people. These are not just different personalities, they are different philosophies of what the institution exists to do, and the courtiers around each man reflect those philosophies. Charles's team is drawn largely from the traditional establishment, experienced royal aides, former diplomats, those who believe the monarchy derives its power from mystique and distance. William's team is younger, more media savvy, more comfortable with transparency and engagement. But here is the detail that crystallizes the conflict. When William launched his Earthshot Prize, his flagship environmental initiative, he deliberately structured it as an independent organization, not under the royal charitable framework that Charles had spent decades building. Independent, with its own brand, its own funding, its own global identity. Those close to Charles were, sources say, not pleased. It was seen as William building a power base that did not depend on his father's approval, and there is something else that very few people have reported: the question of Wales. When William was given the title Prince of Wales following Charles's accession, there was a quiet but significant debate within the palace about the timing and the terms. Charles, sources say, wanted to retain certain elements of the Welsh institutional relationship for longer than William's team felt was appropriate. It was resolved, but the negotiation itself was a signal. This is a relationship managed by agreement and boundary setting, not by warmth and trust. Elizabeth, those close to her say, foresaw exactly this dynamic, and some believe she structured what she left behind, specifically to ensure that William would have enough independence to resist being absorbed into Charles's vision. Whether that is what she intended, or whether it is simply what happened, is the question that haunts the palace to this day. So after everything we have uncovered, the question that matters most is this: does any of it change what happens next? The answer is more complicated than it might appear. Charles is king. That is a fact. That will not change. But the monarchy is not just about who wears the crown in the present. It is about what the institution becomes over the next 50 years. And on that question, Elizabeth's alleged preferences matter enormously. Because if she did intentionally position William as the true architect of the monarchy's future, not just its next king, but its reformer, its modernizer, its salvation, then what we are watching right now is that plan either succeeding or failing in real time. There are signs it is succeeding. William and Kate's approval ratings consistently outperform Charles and Camilla's by significant margins. The public connection that Elizabeth believed was essential to the monarchy's survival, that sense that the crown is not alien to ordinary life, is something William has cultivated with remarkable discipline. His work on mental health, on homelessness, on environmental issues is not accidental. It is a carefully constructed public identity designed to make him feel relevant to a generation that is instinctively skeptical of inherited power. But there are also signs of strain. The relationship between William and Charles remains, by all accounts, carefully managed rather than genuinely close. The disagreements over pace, over modernization, over how much of the old structure to preserve and how much to dismantle, these are ongoing, and they matter because they determine how much runway William has to implement what Elizabeth, if the accounts are accurate, believed needed to happen. There is one final detail that ties everything together, and it is one that has received almost no attention. In the months before her death, Elizabeth made one last series of decisions about the royal collection, the vast accumulation of art, jewels, and historical objects held in trust by the crown. Some of those decisions, sources say, were structured in ways that give William and his heirs direct influence over certain elements of the collection that would normally fall under the sovereign's exclusive control. It was the kind of move that only someone thinking very long-term would make, and it was the kind of move that only Elizabeth could make. Whether you believe she was deliberately bypassing Charles or simply planning responsibly for the long future of the institution, one thing is undeniable. Elizabeth spent the final chapter of her reign building something, and William is now living inside it. The crown passed to Charles, but the blueprint, it seems, was always addressed to William. What do you think? Was Queen Elizabeth right to have doubts about Charles, and did she do the right thing by quietly positioning William? Or does Charles deserve the chance to define this monarchy on his own terms? And is the tension between these two visions of the crown something the institution can survive? Let me know in the comments below.